Josie Callahan smoothed the front of her red dress for the third time in as many minutes, and told herself the shake in her hands was nerves and not the certainty settling low in her stomach that something about this was wrong. The restaurant was the kind of place she had walked past 100 times without ever stepping inside, all white linen and hushed conversation and wine glasses that cost more than her weekly grocery bill. She had gotten the text from her coworker Tricia 2 days ago. A blind date, Tricia had said. A friend of a friend. Older, successful, looking for someone real instead of the usual crowd of women who only wanted his money. Josie had laughed when she read it, because nobody set up the fat girl from the claims department with someone successful, not without an angle. But Tricia had sworn up and down that this was real, that the guy had specifically asked for someone down to earth, someone who wouldn't be impressed by all the flash. Josie should have listened to the small voice that told her nothing about this added up. Instead, she had spent money she didn't have on the dress and told herself that for one afternoon, she was allowed to hope. She saw him before the hostess even pointed her toward the table. He was impossible not to see. He sat alone near the window with his back straight and his shoulders set in a way that made the empty chair across from him look like a mistake waiting to be corrected. His suit was black and cut close enough that it had clearly never seen a department store rack, and his white shirt was open at the collar just enough to show the edge of ink at his throat, dark lines disappearing beneath the fabric. His hair was slicked back and going silver at the temples in a way that made him look less like he was aging and more like he had simply decided that was how he wanted to look. He was not smiling. He was watching the room the way a man watches a room when he is used to being the most dangerous thing in it, and something in Josie's chest went tight and small before she had even reached the table. Then she saw the phones. 4 of them, held up at chest height by 2 women and 2 men standing near the hostess stand, all 4 screens angled at her, all 4 faces lit with the particular glow of people who know they are about to get something worth posting. Josie recognized none of them individually, but she recognized the shape of what was happening immediately, because she had spent 22 years learning to recognize it. This was not a date. This was a show, and she was the punchline that hadn't arrived yet. She kept walking anyway. Some stubborn part of her, the part that had gotten her through every cafeteria table and every gym class and every well-meaning aunt who suggested she try a salad, refused to turn around in front of an audience. She would rather walk into the trap with her chin up than run from it with her back to the room. The man at the table watched her approach and did not look away, and did not look surprised, and did not look anything at all. His eyes were dark, nearly black, and they moved over her once, not with the cruelty she braced for, but with something closer to careful assessment, the way a man reads a document he suspects has been altered before he signs it. Behind her, one of the women near the hostess stand giggled, a high, sharp sound she probably thought was quiet. "You must be Josie," the man said. His voice was low and even, faintly accented in a way that suggested Italian somewhere back in his history, even though his English was flawless. "I am." She made herself hold out her hand instead of hovering by the chair like she wasn't sure she belonged there, because she had learned a long time ago that hesitation only fed the room. "And you're Nico." Nico Salerni. He shook her hand once, firm, brief, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, please." She sat, aware of the phones behind her, aware of the particular silence that had fallen over that corner of the restaurant, the kind of silence that meant people were listening, even while pretending not to. A waiter appeared at her elbow with water, and she thanked him quietly, and when she looked up, Nico was still watching her with that same unreadable focus. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said. "I look like I paid too much for a dress I'm going to return tomorrow," she said, Because if she was going to be humiliated, she was at least going to be honest about it on her way down. Is that better? Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. Better, he agreed. Tell me why. She glanced past him, just once, at the small crowd still lingering with their phones, and back at him. You already know why. He didn't answer right away. He picked up his water glass, turned it slowly by the stem, and set it back down without drinking from it. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped a register, quiet enough that only she could hear it. Tell me anyway. Josie had spent her whole life learning how to swallow embarrassment gracefully, how to make a joke before someone else could make it first, how to leave a room with her dignity even when the room had tried to take it from her. She was not going to lose that skill now, not in front of a stranger in a $500 suit. Trisha from my office set this up, she said, keeping her voice level. I'm guessing it wasn't really about finding you someone down to earth. I'm guessing it was about finding you someone to laugh at, and I walked in right on cue. For a long moment, Nico said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that Josie began cataloging the exits, the fastest route back to her car, the amount of dignity she could salvage if she stood up right now and walked out before dessert arrived. Then he turned his head, just slightly, toward the group by the hostess stand, and something in his posture changed. It was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at them, and one by one, their phones lowered. Get the manager, Nico said to the waiter who had brought the water, not loudly, but in a tone that expected to be obeyed instantly, and always was. Josie's stomach dropped. You don't have to make a scene. I am not making a scene. His eyes came back to her, and for the first time there was something in them that wasn't calculation, something closer to anger, though it wasn't aimed at her. I am ending one. The manager arrived within 30 seconds, a nervous man in his 40s who clearly recognized Nico Salerni and clearly wished he did not have to be standing at this particular table right now. Nico spoke to him quietly, 4 sentences, maybe 5, and Josie caught fragments. 4 guests near the hostess stand, recording without consent. He wanted them gone, and he wanted their table comped, and he wanted it handled without a scene, though the irony of that last request was not lost on Josie, given the audience already gathered. The manager nodded rapidly and hurried away, and within a minute the group by the hostess stand was being quietly and efficiently escorted toward the door, one of the women protesting under her breath, the others too embarrassed to argue. Josie watched them go with a complicated knot of feelings in her chest, satisfaction tangled up with something that felt uncomfortably close to pity, because she knew what it was to be publicly removed from a room, and she would not have wished it on anyone, not even them. You didn't have to do that, she said again, when the room had settled and Nico had turned his attention fully back to her. I know, he said. I wanted to. Why? He considered the question the way he seemed to consider everything, slowly, like he was checking it for hidden edges before he handled it. Because I know what it looks like when someone walks into a trap on purpose, rather than run from it in front of strangers, he said. I have done it myself. It takes a particular kind of nerve. I don't reward the people who try to profit off that nerve by watching them succeed. Josie didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and picked up her water glass instead, and drank while she tried to figure out what kind of man this actually was. The conversation that followed was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected instead. Nico did not ask her the usual first date questions, the ones designed to sort a person into a category within the first 10 minutes. He didn't ask what she did for fun, or where she saw herself in 5 years. Instead, he asked what she did for work, and when she told him she processed insurance claims for a mid-sized firm downtown, he asked a follow-up question that suggested he actually wanted to know the answer, not just fill silence. "What kind of claims?" he said. "Property mostly. Fire damage, water damage, theft." She shrugged. "It's not glamorous. People call me on the worst day of their life and I tell them how much of it their insurance will actually cover, which is usually less than they hoped." "That sounds like a job that requires you to disappoint people professionally." "Every day," she said, and something in the dry way she said it pulled the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she noticed it. "You get good at reading people fast. Who's telling the truth about the fire? Who's exaggerating the water damage? Who's flat out lying because they need the money more than they need the honesty?" "And which am I?" he said. "Tell me what you read." Josie studied him for a moment, the stillness of his hands on the table, the watch on his wrist that looked old and expensive in a way that suggested it had belonged to someone before him, the faint white line of a scar just visible at his jaw beneath a day's growth of stubble. "I read someone who is used to being underestimated and has stopped correcting people about it because it's more useful to let them be wrong," she said. "I read someone who just spent 30 seconds getting 4 strangers thrown out of a restaurant without raising his voice once, which tells me you don't need volume to get what you want. That's rare. Most people who have that kind of power use it loudly because they're not sure it's real unless someone else can see it." The look Nico gave her then was different from anything that had crossed his face so far. Sharper, more focused. The look of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured out. "You're very observant for a claims adjuster. You'd be amazed what people confess to when they think you're just filling out a form." He laughed then, once, short and low, and it transformed his face for just a second before the composure slid back into place. And Josie felt something warm move through her chest that she immediately distrusted, because warm feelings toward strangers in expensive suits had never once worked out well for her. They ordered food neither of them particularly cared about, and the conversation kept moving in directions Josie hadn't planned for. He told her, in careful, edited pieces, about growing up in a family business, about a father who had died when Nico was young enough that most of what he remembered was reconstructed from other people's stories rather than his own memory, about an older brother named Salvatore who had raised him more than their father ever had, and who Nico still measured himself against every single day. He did not say the word family in the way people usually meant it, and he did not say the words mafia or organized crime. But Josie was not a stupid woman, and by the third time he mentioned territory, and the second time he mentioned people who owed him respect, she understood exactly what kind of business Nico Salerni's family was in. She should have been frightened. Some part of her was frightened, but a larger part of her, the part that had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who took one look at her body and decided they already knew everything about her mind, found herself unable to look away from a man who was doing the exact same thing to her, quietly, carefully, and coming to entirely different conclusions than she was used to. "You went quiet," Nico said, near the end of the meal, watching her with that same unreadable focus. "I'm putting pieces together," she admitted. There was no point pretending otherwise with a man who clearly read people for a living too. "I think I know what your family does." And I'm deciding whether that changes anything about the last hour," she said, honestly. "So far, the answer is no. But ask me again after I've had time to think about it properly." Nico studied her for a long moment, and something about the way he did it made Josie feel like she had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "Fair," he said, simply. I would rather you think about it properly than pretend it doesn't matter to make me comfortable. I've had enough women pretend." "I'm not really in the business of making people comfortable," Josie said. "I'm in the business of telling them the truth even when they don't want to hear it. Ask anyone who's had a claim denied." "I believe you," Nico said, and for the first time all afternoon, his voice carried something that sounded almost like relief. The trouble started while they were waiting for the check. Josie noticed it before Nico did, or maybe he noticed it and simply didn't let it show, because a man like him had probably trained his face years ago not to broadcast the moment danger walked through a door. Two men had entered the restaurant and taken a table near the back without ordering anything, and they were watching Nico with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity about his blind date. One of them had a scar bisecting his eyebrow, and the other kept his jacket buttoned in a way that suggested he was hiding something heavier than a wallet underneath it. "Don't look at them again," Nico said, quietly, without moving his own eyes from her face. And Josie realized with a cold jolt that he had clocked the men the same instant she had, maybe before. "Who are they?" "Men who work for someone I have a disagreement with," he said. His tone hadn't changed at all, still low and even, but something in his posture had shifted, gone alert in a way that reminded her he was not just a well-dressed man with a tragic family history. He was something far more dangerous underneath the tailoring. "I need you to do exactly what I tell you, and I need you to do it without arguing, and I promise you an explanation after." Every instinct Josie had ever developed told her to grab her purse and walk straight out the front door and never think about Nico Salerni again. But another instinct, quieter and stranger, told her that whatever was about to happen, she was not going to survive it better by running blind than by staying close to the one person in the room who clearly knew exactly what these men wanted. "Tell me," she said. "When I stand, you stand with me, and you walk on my left side, close, like we're leaving together because the date went well," he said. "There's a service corridor past the kitchen. If anything happens, you go through that door and you do not stop, no matter what you hear behind you." "And if something happens to you?" Something flickered in his expression again, faster this time. Gone before she could name it. "Then you still don't stop," he said. "That's not negotiable." They stood together, unhurried, Nico's hand settling at the small of her back in a way that looked, to anyone watching, exactly like a man escorting his date out after a pleasant afternoon. Josie kept her pace even, her chin up, refusing to let her legs shake even though every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run. As they passed the table where the two men sat, one of them rose halfway out of his chair, and Nico's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against her back, a silent signal to keep moving, keep breathing, keep walking like nothing at all was wrong. They made it past the kitchen doors before anything happened. It was in the narrow hallway beyond, lined with stacked crates and the hum of walk-in coolers, that the man with the scarred eyebrow caught up to them, moving fast, one hand already inside his jacket. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, and Josie would spend a long time afterward trying to reconstruct the order of it, because it happened too fast for her mind to properly file. Nico moved between her and the man in a single fluid motion, no hesitation, no wasted movement, and his hand closed over the other man's wrist before the weapon underneath the jacket ever cleared the fabric. There was a short, ugly sound, more like a controlled collision than a fight, and the man folded against the wall with a grunt, and Nico had already stepped back into position at Josie's side, as though nothing at all had happened. His breathing barely changed. "Go," he said, and this time there was an edge in his voice that had not been there before. But Josie did not go, not immediately, because the second man had appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking the service exit Nico had told her to use, and she understood in a single clear instant that running was no longer an option, only choosing what to do instead. Her eyes landed on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside her, and she didn't think, she just moved, ripping it free and swinging it in a wide arc that caught the second man across the shoulder as he lunged for Nico from behind. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't trained, but it bought exactly the half-second Nico needed to turn and finish what her clumsy swing had started, and within moments both men were down, and the hallway was quiet except for the three of them breathing hard in the cold air of the kitchen corridor. Nico looked at her, at the extinguisher still clutched in her hands, at the fierce, frightened, furious look on her face, and something in his expression cracked open in a way she hadn't seen from him all afternoon. "You were supposed to run," he said. "You didn't leave me a door to run through," Josie shot back, breathless. "So I made a different choice." For a moment, neither of them moved, the adrenaline of the last 10 seconds still hanging thick in the air between them, and then Nico reached out and gently pried the fire extinguisher from her white-knuckled grip and set it on the ground, and his hand lingered against hers a beat longer than necessary. "We need to move," he said quietly, "now, before more of them arrive." They ended up 3 blocks away, in the back of a black sedan that had appeared at the curb almost the instant Nico raised his hand, driven by a silent man Nico called only by the name Enzo. Josie sat with her hands still trembling in her lap, staring straight ahead, trying to process the fact that an hour ago she had been worried about being humiliated at lunch, and now she was riding in a stranger's car after helping fight off 2 armed men in a restaurant hallway. "Talk to me," Nico said, watching her carefully from the other side of the back seat. "Tell me you're all right." "I don't know what all right means right now," she admitted, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "An hour ago I was worried about a bad date. Now I just hit a man with a fire extinguisher." "You saved my life," Nico said, quiet and direct, no embellishment, no performance. "That man had a clear shot at my back. If you hadn't moved when you did, I would be dead in that hallway." Josie turned to look at him properly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. "Why were they after you?" Nico was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness to it that hadn't been there before. "There's a man named Costa who believes my family's territory should belong to him," he said. "He's been probing for weakness for months, sending people to test how I react, how far I'll let things go before I push back. Today was supposed to be a message. I don't know yet whether the message was meant for me or whether someone told him exactly where I would be and who I would be with." The implications settled over Josie like a physical weight. "You think this was about me? That Trisha, or whoever put this whole blind date thing together, was working for him?" "I think it's possible," Nico said carefully. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out, and until I do, I need you somewhere safe. Because if Costa's people know your name, they know where you work and where you live within the hour." Josie felt the floor of her carefully ordinary life tilt sideways. "I have a job. I have an apartment. I have a cat that needs to be fed tonight." "I'll have someone handle the cat," Nico said, and it should have sounded absurd, a mafia boss arranging cat care in the middle of a crisis, but the steadiness in his voice made it sound instead like the most reasonable thing in the world. "I need you to trust me for the next few days. I know that's a great deal to ask a woman I've known for 2 hours." 2 hours and a fire extinguisher," Josie said, and to her own surprise, a small, unsteady laugh escaped her. "That's not nothing." Something in Nico's face softened, the tension around his eyes easing fractionally. "No," he agreed, "it's not nothing." She should have been terrified. In a way, she still was, but underneath the fear was something else entirely, a fierce, clear-headed determination that had carried her through every difficult year of her life. The same instinct that had made her walk into that restaurant with her chin held high, instead of turning around at the sight of the phones. If she was in danger now, she was not going to spend it cowering. She was going to understand exactly what she was dealing with, and she was going to decide, with open eyes, what she wanted to do about it. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the edited version, all of it." Nico studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he did. Over the following 2 days, holed up in a townhouse in a quiet part of the city that Nico owned under a name that was not his own, Josie learned more about his world than she had ever wanted to know, and more about him than she had expected to want. She learned that his brother Salvatore had been killed 4 years earlier in a car explosion meant for their father, who had died of natural causes only months before it happened, leaving Salvatore to inherit a war he hadn't started, and Nico to inherit it from Salvatore far sooner than anyone had planned. She learned that Nico carried a particular kind of guilt about that death, quiet and constant, the guilt of a younger brother who believed he should have seen the threat coming and hadn't. She learned, too, that he asked about her in return, real questions, the kind that required real answers. He asked about her parents, and she told him about a mother who loved her fiercely, and a father who left when Josie was 12 and never fully explained why, though she had her theories. He asked what she wanted, not for the next 5 years, but simply what she wanted. And she found herself telling him things she hadn't said aloud to anyone, about wanting to go back to school for actuarial work, about wanting a life that felt like it belonged to her instead of one she had simply accepted because nothing better had ever seemed available. On the second night, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table in that quiet, borrowed house, Nico reached over and covered her hand with his, careful, deliberate, the first time he had touched her without the excuse of danger forcing it. "Josie Callahan," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone had ever said it before, slower, more deliberate, like he was turning it over and deciding he liked the shape of it in his mouth. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I don't say things like this easily or often." "Say it," she said. "I have known you for 2 days," he said. "By every reasonable measure, that is not enough time to know anything real about a person. But I have spent 4 years since my brother died letting almost no one close enough to matter, because closeness is a liability in my world, and I learned that the hard way. And in 2 days, you have gotten closer to something true than anyone has in 4 years. And I don't know what to do with that except tell you the truth about it." Josie's throat tightened. "That's not a love confession." "No," Nico agreed. "It's more dangerous than that. I'm telling you I don't know how to stop what's already happening. And I should, because it puts you in more danger, not less." She turned her hand over beneath his so their palms met properly and held on. "I walked into that restaurant knowing I might be humiliated, and I stayed anyway. I hit a man with a fire extinguisher for you 2 hours after meeting you. I think it's a little late to ask me to be careful now." Something in Nico's face broke open at that, quiet and unguarded, and he leaned across the table and kissed her, slow and certain, his hand coming up to frame her jaw like she was something worth being careful with even now, especially now. The confrontation with Costa came 4 days later, on a Tuesday evening, in a warehouse near the harbor that Nico's men had traced back to the source of the attack. Josie was not supposed to be there. Nico had told her explicitly, more than once, to stay at the townhouse with Enzo standing guard outside, and she had agreed. And then she had spent an hour pacing the kitchen, unable to shake the certainty that something was about to go wrong in a way Nico wasn't planning for. It was Trisha's name that finally pushed her out the door. Nico's people had confirmed what Josie already suspected, that Trisha had indeed been paid to arrange the blind date as a setup, though not by Costa directly, by a man 2 steps removed who worked for him. And buried in that same intelligence was a detail that made Josie's blood run cold. Costa knew exactly how many men Nico would bring to the warehouse, because someone inside Nico's own organization had been feeding him information for months. Nico didn't know that yet. He had left for the meeting an hour earlier, confident in numbers that had already been compromised. Josie did not have a weapon, or training, or any business at all being anywhere near a warehouse full of armed men. What she had was a phone, and the number for the one person she knew Nico trusted without question, and enough sense to call Enzo the moment she pieced together what Nico was walking into. By the time she convinced Enzo to drive her to the warehouse instead of locking her safely in the townhouse, precious minutes had already burned away, and when they arrived, the scene inside was already unraveling. Nico and 3 of his men facing off against nearly double their number, the numbers Costa had planned for, exactly because he knew what Nico didn't. Josie did not run in blindly. She had learned enough in the last 4 days to know that emotion without strategy got people killed. Instead, she used the one advantage she had that none of them expected. She was unknown to Costa's men, unremarkable, easily dismissed. Exactly the kind of woman a room full of armed men would never think to watch closely. She slipped along the shadowed edge of the warehouse while gunfire and shouting filled the open floor, and she found the panel Enzo had told her about on the drive over, the one that controlled the warehouse's old loading dock doors, and she threw every switch she could find. The doors came down in a deafening crash of old metal, cutting the warehouse floor in half and separating half of Costa's men from the fight entirely, buying Nico and his people the numbers advantage they should have had from the start. In the chaos that followed, Josie watched from the shadows as Nico turned the tide of the fight with the same brutal efficiency she had glimpsed in that restaurant hallway. Precise, economical, never wasted. Until Costa himself stood alone against the wall with nowhere left to go and no one left to protect him. Nico didn't kill him. Josie would learn later that killing Costa outright would have started a war with the families that backed him, and that letting him live, humiliated and stripped of the men who had followed him into that warehouse, was its own kind of victory, the kind that lasted. What she saw in the moment was simply Nico standing over the man who had tried to end his life twice in 1 week, lowering his weapon and speaking 4 words that Josie would never forget. Tell them what happened. Costa fled into the night with what remained of his crew, and the warehouse fell quiet except for the ragged breathing of exhausted men. And it was only then that Nico turned and saw her standing at the edge of the shadows, and the look on his face was somewhere between fury and disbelief, and something that looked entirely too much like love for a man who claimed he didn't say things like that easily. "You were supposed to stay at the house," he said, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You were supposed to know your own numbers were compromised," Josie said, refusing to back down even now, even covered in warehouse dust, with her hands still shaking. "Someone in your organization sold you out. I found that out an hour before you walked in here outnumbered, and I wasn't going to sit in a kitchen while you died because I followed instructions." Nico stared at her for a long moment, and then, in front of every man still standing in that warehouse, he pulled her into his arms and held on like he was the one who needed steadying now, instead of her. "You did this," he said quietly, against her hair. "You turned this fight." "We turned it," she corrected. "You're going to have to get used to that. I don't do things halfway, and I'm not going anywhere." The traitor inside Nico's organization turned out to be a capo named Renzo, who had been skimming from the family for years, and had seen an alliance with Costa as his way out before the books caught up with him. Nico dealt with that matter privately, in ways Josie did not ask about, and he did not offer to explain. And she understood, without needing it spelled out, that this was a part of his world she would let remain his alone. 3 weeks later, Josie sat on the back steps of Nico's actual home, not the borrowed townhouse, but the quiet brownstone he had lived in since before his brother died, watching the last of the evening light fall gold across a small garden that clearly saw more of his housekeeper's attention than his own. Nico came out and sat beside her, 2 glasses of wine in hand, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all, comfortable in a silence that had once been unimaginable between 2 strangers thrown together by cruelty and coincidence. "Trisha's been fired," Josie said eventually. "I heard through the office grapevine. Apparently there were some irregularities in her expense reports that finally got noticed." "Apparently," Nico agreed, without a trace of guilt in his voice, and Josie decided she didn't particularly want to know the details. "I'm not going back to claims work," she said instead, watching the light fade over the garden wall. "I talked to a professor at the community college about the actuarial program. I start in the fall." "Good," Nico said, and the simple, unguarded pride in his voice warmed her more than any grand declaration could have. "You should have started years ago." "I didn't have anyone worth staying for before," she said, and it came out more honest than she intended, but she didn't take it back. "Now I do. That changes what I'm willing to build." Nico turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes steady in the fading light, and reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that still occasionally caught her off guard, coming from a man capable of the things she had watched him do in that warehouse. "They set me up on that date to humiliate both of us," he said quietly. "They thought it would be a joke worth filming. A cruel man and a woman they decided wasn't worth taking seriously put in a room together for their entertainment." "And instead," Josie said, "instead I found the only person in 4 years who looked at everything I am, the good and the very bad, and decided to stay anyway, with her eyes open," Nico said. "I don't know what to call that except the best thing that has happened to me since I buried my brother." Josie leaned her head against his shoulder, the wine going warm and forgotten in her hand, the garden settling into blue evening shadow around them. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into that restaurant 4 weeks ago, braced for humiliation, determined to survive it with her chin up because that was the only kind of survival she had ever been offered. She had gotten something else instead, something she hadn't known to hope for, and she understood now that the room full of strangers filming her walk toward that table had never once seen what was actually happening in front of them. They had been waiting for a joke. What they got instead was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, built not on glamour or rescue, but on 2 people who refused to run when running would have been so much easier, and who chose, deliberately, eyes open, to stay.